So this is vision and hearing in the brain. So I put a picture over here of the division of the brain of the cortex specifically. It's divided into four lobes, as I'm sure you guys know. We have the occipital lobe over here in the back, which we're going to be talking about. We have the temporal lobe. There's actually two parts of it. There's one on each side, which we'll be talking about also. And then there's the parietal and frontal lobes, which we won't be talking about too much today. But you should definitely know them. So how hearing is processed in the brain. So the auditory nerve is a branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. The vestibulocochlear nerve actually branches off into two parts of the nerve. One part goes to the cochlea and the other one goes to the semicircular canal, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. That's more important in your vestibular sense and like your balance and coordination. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And it's excited when hair cells are stimulated. So this nerve goes all the way up to the brain, and it actually leads directly to the thalamus. The thalamus is sort of like the relay center for any of your incoming sensory and motor information. So it processes all sensory information except smell. That's just a little thing that you probably should know. It does 4 out of the 5 senses. Everything goes through the thalamus. So for those of you just joining, I'm just going to ask you to keep your mics muted for most of the lecture. And at the end of each section, I'll give you guys a chance to unmute if you have any questions. And if you have any other questions while I'm speaking, you can put them in the chat box and I'll do my best to address them, or David will address them in the chat. So the thalamus then sends the information to the temporal lobe for higher processing. And like we said before, the temporal lobe is part of the cortex. It's part of your cerebrum. The temporal lobe processes auditory information and olfactory information, auditory being hearing, olfactory being smell. And they house structures like Wernicke's area and Broca's area. So they're also involved in memory and emotion processing, I should say that too. But I know there are some recent studies that have actually kind of said Wernicke's area and Broca's area are a little bit more complex, and they're not as black and white as just be broken down as comprehension and production. But in terms of the MCAT, any sort of study material, anytime I've ever seen it pop up on a test, you should really know that Wernicke's area is primarily involved in speech comprehension, understanding the speech of others, and Broca's area is really mostly involved in the production, you actually physically producing your speech. So those are two pretty important areas. I would definitely know them. This lecture, I don't think is super hard conceptually, but there's a lot of vocabulary and there's a lot of terminology. So if you need any clarification regarding that terminology or anything like that, please put it in the chat. Does anybody have any questions about anything on this slide before we move forward? Okay. And how vision is processed in the brain. So visual information is sent to the brain from the eyes via the optic nerve. So it's another one of the nerves that connects your senses to your brain. So the optic nerve brings this information to the thalamus, because like we said before, the thalamus is pretty much the first stop in the brain for this incoming sensory information, everything except smell. So the specific part of the thalamus that the optic nerve connects to is called the lateral geniculate nucleus. Sometimes you'll see it as LGN. I have seen this appear a couple of times in some of my studies. A lot of times it'll appear in a passage, but it's a very good idea to have an understanding of what this is. And then the information from the thalamus travels to the occipital lobe for higher processing, just like the information that comes in from hearing, it first stops off to the thalamus and then it travels to the temporal lobe for higher processing. They're like association areas, and you integrate it into, a higher sort of perception. So the visual cortex houses specialized neurons that detect specific features of incoming information. So a lot of the sensory information that your eyes take in, it's just raw information. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just an image until it gets passed up to your thalamus and then into your occipital lobe for that higher processing. Then there are these specialized neurons that can detect edges, lines, movement. they're all separate and they're all highly specialized for one job. So you have a lot of specialized neurons up there that help you like differentiate stimuli in your environment and just add meaning to the things that you're seeing. So speaking more about the meaning, your cortex processes multiple features and they can integrate memories and prior knowledge simultaneously in a phenomenon called parallel processing. So parallel processing just means that your brain is taking in a bunch of information at the same time, and it is simultaneously processing all of it. And that's what makes up your perception. So for example, if you are looking at your window and you see a bird, you're going to be looking at it and your brain is analyzing the entire picture and it's taking in a bunch of information at the same time. So it's looking at how far this bird is. It's looking at the contrast of the feathers, the color, the intensity of the color, the relative size of the bird. So all of that information is being sent up to your brain. It's being processed at the same time, and it sort of synthesizes one perception or some mental representation. And it also integrates your memories. So that's what top-down processing is. If you have any prior knowledge, if you're an experienced bird watcher, say, and you have some knowledge about the specific type of bird it is, you see red on the bird and oh, that is a red robin. All of that happens at the same time. That's called parallel processing. And that's why humans are so incredible, and that's why we can do what we do with our minds. Does anybody have any questions about that? Parallel processing is a pretty important concept, especially when the MCAT talks about like cogpsych, cognitive psychology. I see that come up a lot in terms of perception. So just make sure you know that. Like I said, we're going to post these lectures. So if you ever want to come back, you can watch the lectures. You can stop, take notes. You can, take notes from the PowerPoints and study that way.